the Constitution for the new republic.
The issue that was hardest for them to address was the issue of slavery. And they simply postponed it all through that hot summer to the very end of their debates. And they finally brought it up and addressed it.
Most delegates, North and South, never considered eliminating slavery. It was clear any attempt at abolition would have ended the effort to create the United States. While the deals around slavery would shape the national debate for the next 70 years, the words slave or slavery never appear in this founding document.
Now, they do refer to the institution in several indirect ways. There is the notion that the slave trade will not be abolished for at least 20 years. There is the notion that a person who owes service to a master in one state cannot escape that service by removing himself to another state. And that's kind of a fugitive slave clause, but they don't use the word slave or slavery.
The most politically significant deal embraced by the Constitution was the 3/5 clause. It allowed states to count their slave population as 3/5 of a person in determining representation in Congress.
So the fact is, from the South's point of view, they are getting additional political power as a result of their slave population. Except for the 3/5 compromise, Jefferson would have lost that election in 1800. But the slaves are not being represented. The slaves get nothing from this.
And the republic that's created pays the price for that over the next many, many generations.
Black people were betrayed by the new Constitution. But if doors were shutting, they now looked for windows to open. 90% of blacks were still enslaved, but in northern cities, freed black communities were organizing themselves. In southern cities, black artisans were buying their freedom. Both groups ignited an emancipation movement. It began with the founding of the first black Christian churches.
It reinforced family and community. It provided the opportunity for men and women to exercise leadership roles.
Blacks had been slow to accept a religion that they associated with slavery and their masters. But in the mid-18th century, a Protestant revival movement called the Great Awakening introduced a more democratic and expressive form of Christianity, and some black people caught the spirit. Some slave owners, inspired by the values of the Great Awakening and the principles of the new nation, began to free their slaves. Not Thomas Jefferson. In the 1780s, Jefferson published his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia. In it, he argued against this great political and moral evil of slavery, yet at the same time he wrote that blacks were mentally inferior to whites.
It appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, in reason much inferior.
He suggests that they are not as bright, as smart, as intellectually gifted.
Jefferson's theories fueled both sides of the slavery debate. And while he wrote that black people should be free, he never used his power to free them, including during his presidency. Instead, he supported shipping former slaves to Africa.
Jefferson apparently believed that you could not have emancipation without having colonization, which is to say that we can't just let them be free here. That won't work. So if we are going to emancipate them, we have to send them somewhere else.
While some blacks supported colonization, most leaders in the freed black communities of the North denounced the idea.
You know, one of the things that these free blacks said is, I'm a citizen of the United States. My father, my grandfather, fought in the American Revolution to bring this nation into existence. I have as much right to be an American, to live in America, as anybody here.
The generation of blacks born in the late 18th century were raised on the promises of the Revolution and the frustrations of its aftermath. Among them was David Walker. Brought up in the South, Walker would move north to take the emerging abolitionist movement to another level. Walker was born free in the 1790s in Wilmington, North Carolina. He probably learned to read and write in one of Wilmington's first black Christian churches.
These are places which are not only religious places. These are places where political decisions are made, political meetings are held.
By roughly 1820, David Walker made his way to Charleston. There he was exposed to the ideas of Denmark Vesey. A freed carpenter, Vesey was a leader in the new African Methodist Episcopal Church.
David Walker learns from Denmark Vesey. The Bible could be a very, very important tool in giving blacks the strength to resist their enslavement. And he sees how the church in Charleston could be a center for organizing blacks just in terms of numbers and also ideologically rallying them.
Vesey, like many blacks, enslaved and free, had also digested the news about the Haitian Revolution, the slave rebellion which created the first black republic. By 1822, while David Walker was in Charleston, Vesey was organizing a massive rebellion. But someone leaked it, and Vesey, along with more than 30 others, was executed. After that failed rebellion, Walker made his way to Boston. There he would discover not only a virulent racism against black men and women, but a growing political consciousness in the freed black community. In 1820s Boston, Walker became a leading voice in local black churches and organizations.
He is a member of the Massachusetts Colored Association, a black society specifically focused on abolition.
In 1829, Walker sat down to distill his experiences, his analysis of slavery, and his rage. He wrote what came to be known as the most important abolitionist document of the 19th century. He called it an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America.
This is an amazing document, and we can take it as the first maybe expression of black nationalism in this country. And basically, this is a verbal call to arms, asking the African American community to come together and empower itself.
America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears.
The appeal itself lays out the full history of argument against slavery, against slaveholding.
Oh, my colored brethren.
More than that, it is addressed to the colored people of America, saying to them that they have a single aspiration, and that single aspiration is freedom.
We must and shall be free.
Walker modeled the appeal on the Constitution, and he drew from the Declaration of Independence and the Bible.
He says Jefferson and America are hypocrites.
See your Declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language?
He says that America is not doing what it professes to do. It is not expressing the values that it says it believes in.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Compare your own language above, extracted from your Declaration of Independence, with your cruelties and murders.
He says Christians are not living up to the values of Christianity.
In the appeal, Walker directly confronts Jefferson's arguments about black people in his notes on the state of Virginia.
Has Mr. Jefferson declared to the world that we are inferior to the whites?
He believed that racism had become so insidious that it was profoundly demoralizing blacks, making them incapable of acting against the terrible oppression which weighed on them. And his hope was that the appeal would serve to motivate African Americans to fight that.
One of the tremendous elements of David Walker's appeal is his reach into the psyche of blacks, to say first and foremost that we need to think together as a people, but also to focus on the individual, and in a sense to say change begins with you, and you must begin to think differently, not only to think of us collectively as a single people sharing an ultimate aim of freedom, but to think of yourself differently, to think of yourself as an agent of freedom. And what Walker does in his appeal in 1829 is to say, listen, if emancipation is not forthcoming, blood will flow. Oceans and oceans of blood.
Americans, I call God, I call angels, I call men to witness that your destruction is at hand.
Walker distributed his appeal up and down the Atlantic seaboard. He mailed copies to ministers who would read it to the illiterate. The appeal was even discovered in the hands of runaways in North Carolina.
Black activists in the 1830s talk of gathering with others in their communities, to have the appeal read to them, to fire them, to give them increased inspiration to continue on with their struggle, and to help them understand what it was they were fighting.
Well, as you might well imagine, this is shocking and frightening to slaveholders. Immediately, many southern states put out bounties on David Walker's head. They want David Walker delivered from Massachusetts to a variety of places in the South. Of course, southern slaveholders were well aware that there had been many slave rebellions and attempted rebellions all along, but this was particularly frightening because it was an appeal issued by a free black man outside of the South. In other words, outside of the direct control of slaveholders.
One of the people who responded to Walker's charge was the young Maria Stewart, who in 1826 married a free and successful Boston shipping agent. Born free, Maria was orphaned at age 5 and immediately sent into domestic service. She probably learned to read and write in a black church. Three years after her wedding to James Stewart, he died.
Although he had been fairly prosperous, it turns out that upon his death, he had been defrauded by some white businessmen who were his colleagues. And so Maria Stewart was not only widowed, but also left destitute.
A year later, she received more devastating news. Her mentor, David Walker, was found dead in his Boston doorway.
There is reason to believe he may have been assassinated by someone operating on behalf of those people who felt directly threatened by his appeal for slave rebellion.
These compounding losses sparked a religious conversion with political implications.
She sees herself as picking up the torch from David Walker and carrying his work forward.
Stewart began to write and speak in public.
You see her speaking things such as, I committed myself to a life of virtue and piety, and I understood that I might be a warrior and a martyr for the cause of God and my brethren. Well, virtue and piety, perfectly reasonable. It was woman's sphere. It was not a radical position at all. But then in the same sentence, here come the words warrior and martyr and God and my brethren. then she goes right on to say all of the nations of the world are crying out for freedom and independence. And can the sons of Africa remain silent under the heel of tyranny? And it's unprecedented in African American intellectual history.
Why should man any longer deprive his fellow man of equal rights and privileges?
Maria Stewart was the first American woman to address a mixed audience of men and women about political issues. In its time, it was a bold and controversial act.
For Maria Stewart, the highest form of obedience to God was political protest.
Possess the spirit of independence.
Drawing inspiration from the Bible to oppose slavery, Stewart's special concern was the condition of black women.
How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles?
In the early 1830s, Maria Stewart made a number of speeches to black organizations in Boston. In her passion to challenge her audiences to become leaders, she seemed to offend both the men and the women.
Throw off your fearfulness and come.
She's very, very hard on black men and accuses them of being servile, faithless, frivolous, passive.
And make yourselves useful and active members in society.
And she's telling them to get up off their duffs and be active and to be men. So what man wants to be told to be a man?
Have the sons of Africa no souls? Feel they no ambitious desires?
But her words are very important, and that is, African Americans must depend foremost on themselves. They must take the lead themselves. They must uplift the race. That's the way they'd put it in the 19th century. They must uplift the race. And she was critical of anyone in African American community who was not working in every way possible to uplift the race.
David Walker and Maria Stewart are so important for African American history. In a sense, we could think of them as our founding father and mother. They're the first who have a sense of African American people as constituting almost a nation within a nation. We are a nation within a nation, and we need to figure out where we go from here.
They really foreshadow a coming, more militant generation. That generation will use the words, the sentiments, the strategies of Walker and Maria Stewart.
What David Walker and what Maria Stewart understood was that slavery and discrimination would not die as a result of moral persuasion or political activity, because they understood that the first abolitionist in America was the first black person brought off of a ship in chains. They understood only war would bring about the possibility of emancipation of blacks in America.
On August 22, 1831, a small army of the oppressed rose up, and the world of Harriet Jacobs and of slaves throughout the South was forever changed. An enslaved preacher named Nat Turner led 70 slaves in an uprising in Southampton County, Virginia. In a 48-hour period, they killed 57 whites, including women and children.
It is no accident that Nat Turner was a preacher. It is no accident that when he goes to war, he does so based upon commandments that he finds in the Bible, in Christianity. It was disturbing, to say the least, to slave holders that their slaves might spout back to them Christian doctrine which would justify slave rebellion.
As word of the rebellion spread across the South, whites began to lash out. In Edenton, Harriet watched in terror as every person of color became a target.
Groups of white men were rushing in every direction, wherever a colored face was to be found. Everywhere, men, women, and children were whipped till the blood stood in puddles at their feet. Mobs dragged along a number of colored people, each white man threatening instant death if they did not stop their shrieks.
And so, after Nat Turner's rebellion, lots of slaves who had nothing at all to do with the rebellion suffered. Sometimes were killed. Not because they were involved in the slave rebellion, but because white people were more afraid. And when they got more afraid, they were violent, and they were more dangerous.
They had to retaliate. They had to show that, in fact, no black rebellion would or could succeed. And so they struck back. They killed blacks in the countryside. They took and cut off their heads, and they put them on the roadside on stands as a sign to all blacks that they could not and should not rebel.
The South remained on high alert. Patrols guarded roads and gathering places. Slaveholders fostered a martial atmosphere that embraced brutality as a necessity. Leading Southerners, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, had been convinced that slavery was nearing its end. Tobacco had exhausted the soil. The need for slave labor had diminished. That changed in 1803 when President Jefferson signed the Louisiana Purchase and doubled the size of the nation. 4 new states, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, together known as the Deep South, joined the Union as slave states.
Thomas Jefferson, in negotiating of the Louisiana Purchase, declared that he was going to create an empire for liberty. He was going to make an area in which American liberty would expand across the continent. Thomas Jefferson's empire for liberty turned out to be an empire for slavery. The 19th century, the years after the Louisiana Purchase, were the period of the greatest expansion of American slavery ever.
The new land was an ideal match for a new invention, the cotton gin.
The combination of the cotton gin and the Louisiana Purchase made the production of cotton unbelievably profitable. The cotton gin increased the amount of cotton that a single slave could produce in a day by 50-fold. What it meant was that growing cotton was incredibly, incredibly profitable.
In 1808, just as cotton was creating an insatiable appetite for slave labor, Congress abolished the importation of slaves from Africa. Now an already vibrant domestic slave trade would flourish. In the Upper South, the sale of slaves became more profitable than growing tobacco.
Slaves vary wildly in value, from $50 to $2,000, depending on who they are, how old they are. But the valuable ones are very, very valuable.
The slave trade develops its own language. It's the language of big bucks. It's a language of wenches. Of course, this entire language is meant to separate black people from the common run of humanity. It's a language of dehumanization. It's a language of bestiality, to say that these people are, in fact, like animals.
Slave auctions became a common sight, even in the nation's capital.
I got $100 bid. Thank you, sir. Down 81 ought to have hands all over the crowd here. 140. 200. Who'll do that?
If a young woman was put on the auction block, one of the things that they wanted to make sure she could do was have children. They touched people's bodies, both men and women. But you can imagine that for a woman it was incredibly invasive. So they were not above taking her into a back room and examining her to see whether or not she was able to have children. Now, this is the 19th century, so one wonders what an ordinary slaveholder would be doing. But they, even on the auction block, they would feel a woman's breast to see whether or not she could suckle a child.
The specter of the auction block haunted the lives of enslaved people.
Slave mothers knew that this moment might come, and they anticipated it, and they did everything they could to prevent it. They lobbied with their masters. They tried to get sold with their children. But it was something that haunted them from the moment that their children were born, that they might lose them.
More than 1 million people would be sent to the Deep South. Nearly twice as many as were brought to America in all the years of the African slave trade. Many of the enslaved were compelled to march the entire distance, some as much as 1,000 miles. To one observer, the procession of chained slaves resembled nothing so much as a funeral march.
And it took everything they had to keep going. And we also need to remember that some people didn't make it. Some people were depressed, some people were suicidal, some people were vengeful and violent with each other or toward animals or toward children. There was a lot of loss. There was a lot of loss.
While slavery was expanding in the South, the northern states were abolishing it, staking their future on free labor. The nation was becoming two separate societies. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was designed to maintain a balance of free and slave states. Yet, the cotton juggernaut would be unstoppable.
Cotton becomes the key crop, the key cash producer in the life of the nation. For a period of time, there are more millionaires along a narrow band of land along the Mississippi River than in the entire rest of the nation combined. This is a terribly, terribly profitable crop that we're talking about. By 1840, the value of cotton exports was greater than everything else the nation exported to the world combined. And that made slaves the most valuable thing in the nation beside the land itself.
As the price of slaves soared, slave traders began to roam the North, abducting free black people. In April of 1841, Solomon Northup found himself in one of the many slave pens lining the streets of Washington, D.C. Born a free man, he lived in New York State with his wife and 3 children.
The idea began to break upon my mind that I had been kidnapped, but that I thought was incredible. It could not be that a free citizen of New York should be dealt with thus inhumanly. It was a desolate thought. I bowed my head and wept.
He was a free person. He knew he was a free person. And so here he is in a situation where it doesn't matter It doesn't matter. The color of your skin marks you as a potential slave.
In Washington, D.C., slave auctions were a daily occurrence. Chained human beings were marched routinely in front of the Capitol.
If you can picture Solomon Northup, a free man who has lived a good portion of his life in New York State, and he sees himself in chains, being taken away to slavery. Think about the contradiction. Here you have the federal capital of the United States, the nation dedicated to the proposition of human freedom, tolerating, profiting from the selling of human beings into bondage.
Enslaved people labored from sunup to sundown, and when the moon was full, they continued into the night. Children as young as 9 picked cotton.
And now we had to start thinking about people as slaveholders thought about people, and that is as machines. You have to keep your machines working at top speed for as long as possible.
Having made their fortunes in the Deep South, planters turned their attention to gaining political power, becoming governors, congressmen, senators, and presidents.
Cotton and the slave labor force which made the production of cotton possible was incredibly powerful economically. And in the 19th century, as in the 21st century, economic power translated into political power. In the 72 years between the election of George Washington and the election of Abraham Lincoln, 50 of those years sees a slave holder in the White House.
It is they who write the laws. It is they who adjudicate those laws. It is they who enforce those laws. The United States is truly a slaveholding republic.
Though they had abandoned slave labor in their own region, Northerners were making huge profits from slavery. Cotton generated an extensive textile industry in New England. Insurance companies insured slaves as property. Many Wall Street firms got their start as middlemen in the cotton trade. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts called it a conspiracy of the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash. The economics of slavery had torn Lewis Hughes from his family. Now he would find another.
People grab other people and they make blood kin out of people who are not kin. It's resilience, it's survival, it's a way to survive. It's a way to make a way out of no way, to create a family when it is being torn and split apart.
It saved people who were vulnerable in so many ways to physical and psychological abuse. Someone else in the quarters or in the kitchen who says, "Here's a little cake for you," or "How are you?" or "Help me." These are the other sides of these, not blood relationships, but kin relationships nonetheless.
Lewis Hughes would grow strong and healthy. The thought of freedom never far away.
I used to hear Boss read in the papers about runaway slaves who had gone to Canada, and it always made me long to go. Yet I never appeared as if I paid the slightest attention to what the family read or said on such matters. But I felt that I could try at least to get away.
When he was 20 years old, Lewis summoned the courage and fled, only to be caught and return.
My clothing was removed, and the whipping began. Boss whipped me a while. Then he sat down and read his paper, after which the whipping resumed. This continued for 2 hours. Then he used tree switches which cracked the flesh so the blood oozed out. It was weeks before I could bear clothing touching my skin.
Whippings often ended with a bucket of salt water poured on the wounds.